Hi, everyone. Our group will be discussing the American housing crisis. So to first address the American housing crisis, we need to first look at the history of the federal government's involvement with affordable housing through policy and how the failure of federal housing policy continues to contribute to systemic racism today. We'll be looking at FDR's New Deal, which is the first federal public housing legislation. In this period during the 1930s and 40s, there was the Great Depression, where there was a shortage of housing, food, there was high employment and homelessness, and the economy was at a complete standstill. President Roosevelt created the New Deal to take America out of the Great Depression and revitalize the country after World War I and World War II. So, and it's really important to recognize the fact that there has been no federal public housing policy before FDR's New Deal, meaning that the New Deal kind of revolutionized housing in America, and contributing to that was the first piece of legislation, which was the National Housing Act, as well as the first housing committee of the federal government, which was the Federal Housing Administration. The overall impact of the New Deal created public housing units. The government attempted to provide effective and affordable public housing. However, it was only designed to serve white, middle, or lower class families. People of color were left out of these new and exciting suburban public housing units, and they were further pushed into urban public housing projects. This demonstrates how federal policy has intensified racial and housing segregation. In the next coming slides, I will also be looking at a specific case study in Long Island, New York, to show how housing policies can continue to segregate residents by race. And there are practices such as redlining that also contribute to systemic segregation. Redlining is the discriminatory and unethical practice of systemically denying services to residents of a neighborhood that is associated with a particular race. And these discriminatory practices could affect job opportunity, your education, healthcare access, and banking. Specifically, bank redlining refused to insure mortgages in and near Black neighborhoods. And essentially, the Federal Housing Administration paid builders to mass produce housing for only white people, and with the requirement by law that no homes would be sold to Black people, and basically drawing out the districts to only support white people of higher income. Here is a timeline of the federal housing policy in America. And as I discussed in my earlier slide, the creation of the first federal housing policy was throughout the Great Depression and the World Wars, where there was a need for housing reform. In 1937, the U.S. Housing Act was passed, which allowed more low-income and middle-income families to own their homes. And as I mentioned in the earlier slide, however, this mostly contributed to ownership of white residents and not Black residents. In 1944 was the GI Bill was created, which granted programs designed to help veterans adjust to American society after being in the war. These programs included low-cost mortgages and low-interest loans, as well as government funding for education and healthcare, so these veterans would be able to afford homes. However, even though the Veteran Administration guaranteed over 2 million home loans. These benefits were denied to Black veterans. As home ownership was made possible for millions of white veterans, the GI Bill created an institutionally unjust system that left Black veterans out from receiving federal benefits. And then throughout time, we can see that there's actually, when we reach the 60s, it's the Fair Housing Act, which is the Civil Rights Act of 1968, which is a turning point in housing policy legislation. Now citizens are protected from discriminatory practices like redlining, renting and buying through the Federal Housing Administration. And this was like the first piece of legislation that really protected homeowners and home buyers of not just white people, but also people of color. There's also amendments of housing legislation, such as the Section 8 Amendment, which provided vouchers for low-income families so they would be able to rent a home from a private landlord without paying mostly out of pocket for housing. And we continue going into the 2000s. We have the Faircloth Amendment, which restricted the number of public housing units that were available, which I will also be getting into later. And then finally, we reach the Green New Deal, which is AOC's introduction of her plan to revitalize the country as Roosevelt did. So as I said, we'd be looking at a specific example, and we will be looking at Levittown in Long Island. So according to the 2010 census, Long Island is the most racially segregated, one of the most racially segregated regions in the country. And through looking at this one neighborhood in Long Island, Levittown, we can see that housing segregation is fueled by racial intent, which leads to other forms of structural racism. I think it's important to mention that Levittown is considered to be the first modern American suburb, which paved the way for the development of similar suburban neighborhoods to be developed. I mentioned the GI Bill again because Levittown itself was funded through these federal loans that were given to veterans. However, as we know that this did not mean for all veterans, as Black veterans were excluded from home ownership. So Levittown specifically had a provision in their town law that prevented tenants from allowing people of color to use or reside in these suburbs. And then I referenced the Supreme Court case of Corrigan versus Buckley, which ruled that racially restrictive contracts were legally binding, which means that the town of Levittown, Long Island, legally could prevent the sale of homes to Black people and people of color. And we can see that this housing policy continues to have a lasting effect on American society today because by the 2009 census, the Black population in Levittown only grew to 0.5%. Yes, not even 1%, but just 0.5, 0.5%. And the impact on society today was that the suburbs were, the vision of a perfect and American neighborhood, but it's actually, not even close to perfect because it's not representative of, the actual makeup of America, and this further exacerbates segregation. I mentioned white flight, which is white families of higher income moving out of urban areas um, with a majority of people of color and into suburban areas. Um, this also exacerbates housing segregation and is, clearly shown that, the like people of color were prevented from, living in these suburban towns because of housing policy. And then finally, I will address some solutions to the American housing crisis, also looking at policy. I referenced the Green New Deal, which is legislation created by AOC and Bernie Sanders to build more public housing and repeal the Fair Cloth Amendment. So to invest in public housing, we need to make sure that we can actually build more public housing. So it's really important to first repeal the Fair Cloth Amendment because it is 20 years too outdated, and there deserves to be more equitable and there deserves to be more public housing. And this has been addressed since 2017. And then I also wanted to make comparisons from the Green New Deal to the New Deal, and how during two similar time periods where in the New Deal there was a nationwide recession, considerably wartime, there was high unemployment and a housing crisis, and we can compare that time period to the COVID pandemic where we were in also an economic recession. There was high unemployment, and we're in the middle of a housing crisis. So I think it's important that even though there is criticism and backlash of the Green New Deal, there hasn't been extreme federal housing reform since the New Deal. It's for over 100 years. So it's really important that to solve the American crisis, we need to go back. We need to look at the laws that that this country has founded their housing policy on over 100 years ago, and change that to look like a more holistic America today.
Oh, my name is Christian Gooding, and my part on this presentation is the issue plaguing our country, which is how America's housing crisis, and that in all places all over the country, the cost of housing has eclipsed the advances in salaries. Home prices are increasing at twice the rate of wages, while there are also fewer houses on the market than any year since 1982. Devin? As you can see from this chart, as the years go by, the real median household income has had a sharp decline ever since 2006 all the way to 2012. On the same note, the home price index has also declined from 2006 to 2010, but has made a sharp rise since 2012 to the present. As times have changed, the government aid is simply not enough to fund people's mortgages or rent in today's housing market. Previous homeowners are now left looking for affordable housing in a scarce market. As you can see from the example here, his name is Will. He was previously a homeowner. He owned a business in Tennessee, but as the the home price index that went up, he was unable to afford a home in his current city. So he ended up having to living out of his truck since 2018, I believe, when they said in the article, and he's been living like this ever since. And when the COVID-19 pandemic hit, he was hit even harder. He was forced to be able to move out of his truck, move out of his the parking lot he was living in because of the strict restrictions within COVID-19. And this is just an example of how previous homeowners are now left looking for more affordable options and different options now because of the COVID-19 pandemic. And for my final slide, I want to talk about the racial disparity now within the America's housing crisis. Now that it's not affecting every race, but I just feel that the African Americans have been unequally been targeted during this America's housing crisis, and that home ownership by African Americans have plummeted nearly twice as much as their white counterparts since the 2008 housing market crash. And this clearly shows that the African Americans are being racially targeted and that they're obviously being at a disadvantage when it comes to finding houses in today's society.
Hello, my name is Devin, and I noticed that a lot of people are living in a cycle of poverty. So 75% of extremely low income families that are already very cost restrained are spending more than half of their income on rents, which makes it really hard to escape this cycle, this trap of poverty, because they're spending so much of their income on rent. It leaves them with very little to spend on food and other necessities for survival. This statistic has actually recently increased with the pandemic, but 78% of American workers are living paycheck to paycheck right now. It used to be 59%, but now it's 78% because more people are desperate and they're living paycheck to paycheck to sustain their current quality of life. And another statistic is in March of 2020, right around before the pandemic, 40% of every household making less than $40,000 per year lost a job, whether it was to the pandemic or another cause. So as you can see here, there's a drastic change in the median cost of rent. And although it's increased dramatically, the change in median wage has stayed relatively the same. So as you can see by the chart, the correlation between the two changes doesn't necessarily match up, which is leading to a lot of people struggling all around the country because they don't have the income to sustain the rise in the cost of their rent. So why does this all matter? When you're increasing the cost of the rent without also increasing the wage, it leaves people with a lack of income because they can't support themselves. They're trying to pay their rent, but some people don't even have enough to put food on the table. So the correlation between rent and wage doesn't match. There's no leftover money to save for their future. So forget about sending their kids to college to educate them and move on from poverty. And another major thing is that people are being pushed out of urban areas, which is forcing people to move to the suburbs. And when you're in the suburbs, you have to spend a lot on transportation. Now, in my personal experience, my father lived in central New Jersey and had a job in New York City. And every day he had to drive into New York City. So he's paying gas, tolls, maintenance on the car, and he does that every day, multiple times a week. And the costs rack up quite a lot. So every person that has to commute into the city or has a long commute, it adds to the cost of their transportation, which in turn, correlating it back to rent, they don't have as much to spend on rent. Now, how does COVID-19 have an impact on this? There's an accumulation of debt among everybody renting. So everybody that's renting is building up debt to their landlords, and then the landlords can't pay for their taxes, and the landlords are going to suffer, and then they can't help out any of the people renting. Any of the people that are renting, they're using up their savings accounts, so they don't have any money to save for future endeavors. And then another major thing is that families are oftentimes choosing between spending their money on food or spending their money on rent, which is a position that nobody should have to be in. All right, so I have a video that I want to show about COVID's impact on the housing crisis. All right, so I think the takeaway from that video is that COVID made it extremely challenging for all of the renters around the country to pay their rent, take care of their families. And although they're asking for debt forgiveness, I feel like that's something impossible to actually execute, because there's a trickle-down consequence that affects the landlords and all the other people in real estate. However, then you think about the alarming statistics, like 1/4 of US renters spend half of their income on rent. And how do you solve that? It's up to the government to get involved and take action. So here are our sources. I hope you enjoyed this video, and perhaps you'll get involved in the housing crisis one way or another. Take care. Bye-bye.